Hey guys, Jason here with the second video of my 3-part DM-13 analysis series. In the last video, I went over what I considered to be the most noteworthy cards from DM-13, and in today's video, I'll be going over how a global release of DM-13 might have affected the metagame during the TCG's original run in the mid to late 2000s. Before we get into it, here's a summary of what I consider to be the most important decks from back in the day. Documented official tournament results for the TCG showed Bombazar Blue and Rub Control as the last major frontrunners. However, it's worth pointing out that the last major tournament before the game died was the North American Continental Championships in 2006, which only went up to set 10, so these results only form part of the picture. To get a better idea of what the TCG meta might have looked like in a DM-13 timeline, I'm also going to consider relevant OCG decks at around the time of set 13, my recollection of old message board posts, and my own personal opinions on what strategies I think people may have tried. So starting off, we'll take a look at the infamous Bombazar Blue, a fast and steady build for the old Dragon of Destiny. The first list we'll look at is unsurprisingly the very famous North American Continental Championships winning list. As far as old lists go, I think this one is pretty efficient. The inclusion of Max Windax and 2 Scarlet Skyterror seems a bit excessive to me, but I guess it worked because Thrashcrawler can be a bit annoying, and this player likely dispatched any Taj Mahal and Pal-Olesis in his way. Moving over to Japan, here's a very similar list, which also won a big tournament in the DM-10 format. It drops Gonta and opts to play a little slower because it has the option to use Curse Totem. It also plays board wipes, and I think Apocalypse Vice is a very good inclusion here because like Scarlet, it can deal with blockers, but it also works against other things. So now that we have a pretty good idea of how people were playing Bombazar Blue, let's take a look at how the deck might have been played in the alternate timeline. The first sample list continues with the aggressive mindset of just attacking to win. I don't think sets 11, 12, and 13 introduced cards that would have completely revolutionized Bombazar Blue as we know it, so it's not drastically different to what we just covered. I think people might have tried things like Miraculous Rebirth and Pyrofighter Magnus, which is why I have them in the list. But as far as aggressive Bombazar goes, I actually don't even know if Bombazar Blue is for sure the best way to play it. I think the more glass cannon-ish Fire Nature version, which saw play in Japan, could lay claim to that title. However, due to the fixation on Aquahulcus and the Water Civ at the time, I think it's unlikely people would have gone that route, which is why I'm not covering it and just mentioning it here. Moving on to my final list for Bombazar Blue, my second sample list incorporates Judgment because why not? It might help in a situation where the deck is outsped by the opponent and Gonta does at least survive it. As a side note, I think Shaman Broccoli could be good in these sorts of builds as well, but I doubt people would have played it. Anyway, that's it for Bombazar Blue. But that is not it for Bombazar in general. There are a couple of different ways to play Bombazar, so next we'll take a look at Bombazar Black, the primary inspiration for our Swap Box deck profile. Grub decks didn't have too many top-placing finishes at official TCG tournaments, aside from that really strange one with Double Geyser, but there's no doubt in my mind that Rub players would have been tempted by the allure of Soul Swap. Back in the day, I suspect some Japanese players found the original Bombazar Blue to be too linear and felt Darkness could improve some of their matchups, particularly against other Bombazar decks. So here's a Bombazar Blacklist from before Bombazar was Hall of Famed. Gallic was a mainstay in this archetype because it was really good against Control and Aquan decks, which could give Bombazar a hard time. Ancient Horn was a pretty common tech as well, because most decks around this time didn't attack early, meaning players could quite often pull off its effect. The free summon is really good because this deck attacks to win, and Bombazar appreciates having an extra attacker that isn't easy to get rid of. This one is more aggressive than what I'm used to, but hey, it did pretty well at the tournament. But I think the catalyst that really established Bombazar Black as a deck was Bombazar getting Hall of Famed. Being restricted to 1 meant players couldn't just try to turbo into Bombazar and win off that. While they could feature him, they had to find other ways to win. I think this archetype is actually pretty cool because it features Bombazar alongside several other finishers. It's similar to the last one, but this list has Bolmedius as an alternate finisher, and it features Jagalzor, who functions as a synthetic Bombazar by opening up explosive plays. Curse Totem was also commonly played in these kinds of decks, but was strangely missing from the lists I found, so I modified this one to squeeze one in. But there you go, a gorgeous good stuff pile featuring Bombazar and a bunch of other finishers. As for the TCG, assuming no restrictions, here's a sample Bombazar Grub deck in a DM-13 format. It's basically a good stuff pile, and like the OCG versions, it aims to quickly ramp with nature weenies and nuke the board while drawing a bunch of cards with Judgment. Unlike the OCG versions though, it runs Aquahulkus because, as we know, the TCG player base just loves that card. Gallic and Dimension Splitter are also in the notes rather than in the main list, because I don't think people would have gravitated towards them, especially in the case of Gallic because of all the strong spell-based removal. And here's my final sample list for Bombazar Black. This one assumes Bombazar was Hall of Famed in the TCG. Bombazar was famously put on watch list by Wizards of the Coast back in the day, but no action was taken since the game died soon after. I do think that it's possible for Wizards to have taken action if the game lived for just a few months longer. This Bombazar Black list is a bit slower, and like the OCG list, runs Bolmedius and Bazagazil as alternate finishers. It also runs blockers, notably Bloody Skeeto, who could deal with Gonta. Alright, so we've just gone through a bunch of lists, and you're probably tired of hearing about Bombazar by now. Thankfully, it wasn't the only relevant deck in the TCG era. Today, we know that most Rub variants are actually mid-range decks, but back in the day, Rub was, for most of the TCG's life, regarded as the way to play Control. The first list we'll take a look at is the deck that made it to the finals at NACC 2006, the tournament that was ultimately won by earlier's Bombazar Blue list. It uses some of the new Spirit Quartz cards from set 10 and doesn't run any Chargers, which I disagree with, but it does show hints at where the archetype is heading, like dropping Searing Wave for Blizzard of Spears and running Crystal Memory. The next list we'll look at is the one featured on Duel Masters USA's YouTube channel. It belongs to Tom Rogers, who I believe was ranked as the #1 player in the US before the game died. The deck profile came out in 2020, so I'm not entirely sure how often this list was modified over the years, but for the purposes of this video, I'll just assume it's what Tom used back in the day. It's very teched out and places greater emphasis on Velorica over Bolmedius and Bazagazil. The Meltdown Pyro combo is also present in this list. It's notable to me because while this combo is very well known today, I'm not sure how well documented this strategy was at the time. But hey, I guess he was the best player for a reason. As for DM-13, here is my sample Rub control list. It just uses all the classic Rub elements like Chargers, Board Wipes, and the other usual suspects. Spiralgate and Bloody Skeeto are present as well, mainly to address Gonta. Like I talked about with the previous list, Meltdown Pyro is a bit of a question mark, but all in all, it's a fairly generic list for the time, and it runs Judgment. Earlier, I mentioned that Rub was the way to play Control back in the day, but I do think that with a bit of time, people would have realized how strong Light could be in a Control deck, like how it's viewed today. I struggled to find evidence of Ruby decks making top placements at official TCG tournaments, but the style definitely had its following. Pojo forum member and DM writer Cecil Bill was famous for being an early practitioner of Foul Control back in the day, and I get the sense some people would have picked up on the combination when the game was on its way out. So like I talked about with Grub earlier in the video, I think players might have experimented with the classic Rub formula and tried things like Grub, and in this case, Ruby. Unlike in the TCG, Ruby variants, or I guess UBY variants with a splash of fire, was the main way to play Control in Japan. Due to the 40-card limit, Deckout was the preferred strategy at this time, so no Bolmedius to swing for shields. Because the TCG did not have the 40-card limit, nor do I think it would have gotten it had it continued, I think this means of playing Control would not have worked. But I wanted to show an OCG list from a comparable era of the game, so here it is. So let's go back to the TCG. The next list we'll take a look at is an early list from Earth Power's YouTube channel. I think this decently captures the spirit of the idea and the player base's mindset at the time, especially since it runs the draw 1 creatures. This list cuts down on some cards from the rub sieves to make room for light, and I believe this is done because Spell Search, Spell Retrieval, and Tajamal can make the deck much more resilient. And now that we've looked at the general environment, here's my sample Ruby control list for the alternate timeline. It takes ideas from both lists and adds judgment. Bolmedius is the main finisher, because slashing to win by deckout was just not a thing in the TCG. And even though I personally think Aquahulkus and Corile don't really belong in this deck, every air quotes control deck from back in the day ran 4 of each, so I've just continued with that trend for this sample list. I don't know about you guys, but I think I've spent enough time talking about control. Now is time for some good old Rush. Interestingly, there isn't much documentation on Rush decks for the latter part of the TCG's life, perhaps due to the last big tournament taking place before set 11. But because Rush decks are both viable and budget-friendly, there's no doubt in my mind they would have seen play. I'll start with the most famous and powerful TCG Rush deck of all time, Fire Nature Rush. This is Earth Power's list, and you'll notice the archetype has changed very little throughout the years. I do think the player base at the time would have favored Screwdriver over Volcanic Arrows because Screwdriver is reusable and a creature. I also get the feeling people might have been allergic to the drawback of Volcanic Arrows, even though I personally prefer it. But yeah, Fire Nature Rush, not a whole lot to say. It doesn't use DM-13 cards because it doesn't need them. Meanwhile in Japan, the outlier came second at a tournament, only losing to the Bombazar Blue list we covered earlier. This isn't an exact card-for-card recreation of the second place list, because Fanu wasn't released until 2005, but this list is the most famous Firelight Rush list from this era. I think this particular build is interesting because of the anti-Bombazar tech. Win and Migalo can help it dodge Aqua Surfer and I guess Burst Shot and Shields. Jilwarka could be a pain for the opponent to deal with because it could tap blockers when removed, making it easier to swing for face, and it made it trickier for Bombazar to finish the game. The deck also has Holy Awe, so there's that. I'm sure TCG players would have found out about this and tried Firelight Rush for themselves, especially in a meta with Bombazar. And here's another Firelight Rush build. This one is from the DM Plays Strongest Deck special event from earlier this year. There is less emphasis placed on beating Bombazar, though it still is very fast and runs Holy Awe. It's another interpretation of Firelight Rush, and it uses cards from the first 13 sets, so people might have tried something similar in the DM-13 timeline. Zakranba might be an unfamiliar name to many because it's a DM-13 card. Well, it's a 2-drop 1k creature that gets an extra 2k power boost when all the cards in your mana zone are tapped. I've sped through a bunch of decks, and we're nearing the end of the video, but there are still some powerhouse cards I haven't talked about, so now's the time. As I've been saying for a lot of the video, the North American Continental Championships, the last documented major event for the TCG, took place before the release of sets 11 and 12, so it can be argued that the TCG functionally died at around set 10. With a planned set 13, I think it's possible that support for the TCG could have continued for just a little bit longer, and players may have had extra time to figure out cards like Petrova and Warlord Elzonius, who were powerhouses in both the OCG as well as in the modern metagame. I think Warlord Elzonius is a card that is too good to ignore, especially in a classic TCG setting. We'll start by covering a beatdown style list akin to how it's usually played in the TCG today. It attempts to outpace Bombazar, and with Warlord being untargetable, should have a good matchup against Control. Spiral Gate is present as an answer to Gonta. For Warlord list number 2, we have a more mid-rangey build which runs hard removal and disruption. It's actually somewhat reminiscent of some of the old OCG Warlord lists. As good as Lightwater Elzonius is, I think there are gaps in the deck that Darkness can help with. I'm not gonna lie to you, this list is quite jank, but this is the kind of list I think TCG players in 2006 might have experimented with. For the final list of the video, we have Lightwater Dark Control. I think people would have been aware of the synergy between Pala Elysis and Petrova at around this time. I might be misremembering, but I do recall seeing some old forum posts from the mid to late 2000s raving about this strategy. Anyway, here's a good stuff pile that uses the combo. It's not quite Hydro Hurricane, but it takes elements from the strong core and combines it with the old deck building mindset of Max Hulkus in everything and Terrapit and Loco as 4-ofs. And that brings me to the end of the video. My summary of the relevant decks we might have seen had the TCG continued for a little bit longer. Before we close, I must once again state that I do not believe that these lists are optimized. They are merely my imagining of what we might have seen in this alternate timeline. In saying that, it's really interesting to look back and see what cards have fallen out of favor, what cards still continue to earn their keep, and what cards were slept on. In the next and final part of this series, I'll be covering how I think DM-13 might have affected the decks in a modern TCG competitive setting, so stay tuned for that. But that's all for now. As always, thanks for watching, stay safe, and we'll see you guys next time.